The villagers gathered at dawn, drawn by whispers of something unnatural drifting against the shore. At first they thought it was wreckage, another broken vessel, another tragedy claimed by the sea. But as the tide pulled back, the truth revealed itself. A ship, massive and silent, had run aground without warning. Its sails hung in tatters. Its wood groaned like a coffin dragged from the deep. They climbed aboard, expecting survivors, men begging for water, sailors clinging to life. Instead, they found row after row of bodies, strapped to benches, bound to rails, slumped in unnatural stillness. Their clothes clung to bone. Their mouths were frozen open, as if caught mid-cry, and their eyes gone. Every skull stared forward with hollow sockets, as though gouged or claimed by something no one could name. No food, no water, no sign of struggle. Every body still in place, as though obedience had lasted even into death. It was not chaos. It was order, preserved in horror. Who kept them tied? Who stripped their eyes? And most haunting of all, what force guided this ghost ship to shore long after life had left it? When investigators first dared to set foot on the cursed vessel, they carried lanterns, though it was not night. The gloom that wrapped the decks demanded light, as though the ship itself resented intrusion. Every creak of the timbers sounded like breath. Every flicker of flame revealed bones tied neatly in place. The sailors were not sprawled as victims of panic. They were fastened with deliberate precision, as if they had agreed to remain seated in death. They searched for a logbook, for names, for evidence that this was not some elaborate spectacle designed to terrify. In the captain's quarters, they found records ending abruptly months earlier. Routes plotted, orders written, cargo listed, then nothing. It was as if the pen had simply lifted and never returned. On the table lay a compass, but its needle spun without rest, refusing to settle on north, as though the earth itself rejected the ship's alignment. The investigators noted details that made no sense. Shackles fastened not just to arms but to ribs, as if someone had gone back after death to ensure no body slipped loose. Ropes that showed no fray, no weathering, though the sails above had been shredded, and food stores locked, untouched, barrels still sealed with wax. The crew had not starved from lack of supply. They had starved while provisions surrounded them, as though forbidden by some silent decree. Below deck, they found a chamber sealed from within. It took hours to force the door open, splinters flying, iron nails shrieking against the wood. Inside was a single figure, dressed in what might have been the captain's coat. His skull was different. The sockets were wider, carved not by decay, but by deliberate cutting, the bone fractured outward, as if something had pushed through. In his lap rested a book too damaged to read in full. Only fragments survived, words in a script older than any sailor aboard. One line could be made out with certainty. The sea does not return what it takes, unless it wishes to send a message. Another, blindness is the price of obedience. The rest was illegible, scorched as though fire had licked its pages without burning the wood around it. Who wrote it, and whether it was warning or confession, no one could decide. Villagers whispered theories. Pirates who punished betrayal. A cult that demanded sacrifice at sea. A plague so strange it hollowed faces before flesh. Yet none explained why the bodies stayed bound, why not a single man appeared to resist. No claw marks on wood, no broken nails, no ropes strained against knots. Death had come not in chaos but in discipline, like a performance whose audience could never be named. The longer they remained aboard, the more the air seemed to thicken, though no rot could be smelled. Men began to hear things, the sound of oars cutting water, though none moved, the scrape of boots across decks where no one walked. One lantern shattered when no hand touched it. Another investigator swore he saw one skull tilt, as if still following orders unseen. A sailor ran screaming when he thought he heard whispers in the language scrawled in the captain's ruined book. They tied him down in the village for days, but his eyes never closed again, as though he feared the dark itself. They fled at last, leaving the bodies untouched. Authorities ordered the vessel sealed, towed away, hidden from shores where its story might spread. But stories do not stay buried. Sailors in nearby ports began speaking of ships glimpsed with no lanterns lit, drifting without crew, vanishing at dawn. Some claimed to hear the sound of 100 men breathing in unison as the hull passed by. Others said the waves carried bones that washed ashore in silence, their sockets just as empty as those aboard. And always the same dread detail returned, the hollow sockets watching from the dark. The rumor grew. Anyone who looked too long into those eyeless faces would dream of the same voyage, chained to the same deck, their own sight stolen by dawn. A punishment, a contagion, or perhaps an invitation. What kind of voyage ends with every soul bound, every eye taken, and the ship itself arriving home without a living hand to steer it? Was it fate, or something steering from below the waves, claiming not just lives but sight itself as payment. And if such a force guided one ship to shore, how many more are still drifting, unseen, waiting for the tide to carry them home? The ship was hidden, chained in a government dock, covered with tarps to keep curious eyes away. Yet curiosity is stronger than commands, and word spread among sailors who feared silence more than storms. They whispered that the vessel was no ordinary wreck but a floating prison, a ship cursed not by weather but by its own captain. The legend grew, a man who promised his crew salvation but instead delivered them into a pact they could never escape. Documents smuggled out of the captain's quarters confirmed he was not unknown. He had commanded voyages across the Atlantic, notorious for discipline so harsh that men described his orders as chains even before the ropes appeared. He recorded rules in ink as if they were scripture. No man to break formation, no man to leave his post, no man to disobey the captain's voice, even under threat of death. Sailors joked that he wanted obedience so perfect that it would last into the grave, yet the joke became real. As investigators pieced together the fragments, a story emerged. The voyage had begun with cargo ordinary enough, grain, timber, iron tools, but the captain believed storms, mutiny, and hunger could all be defeated by devotion. He sought a crew who would follow not just orders, but faith. He whispered of immortality earned through discipline. He taught that the ocean itself was listening, rewarding those who obeyed without hesitation. And the crew, half in fear, half in awe, followed. At first, his methods seemed cruel but effective. Men ate in silence. No one sang. No cards, no dice, no laughter on deck. They stood at their posts long after their bodies ached, their eyes locked forward as if the horizon itself demanded worship. He reduced sailors into statues, claiming that unity was their shield. And when a storm struck, they held their places while other ships scattered. When sickness struck, they strapped themselves to rails rather than collapse. Obedience had become instinct, so deep it was almost ritual. But the sea does not forgive. One by one, their eyes began to fail. Not by disease, not by injury, but by some strange wasting. Men awoke with their sockets dark, shrieking as if something had been taken in the night. The captain forbade panic. He ordered them bound to benches, claiming the sea was testing their faith. Those who begged for release were tied tighter. Those who cried were gagged. And when men died, their bodies were not buried at sea. They were kept, strapped in their places, as though absence itself was forbidden. The surviving notes show the captain's descent. He began to write not to his superiors, but to the sea itself. We remain as statues before your gaze. We do not resist. Take our sight if you must, but carry us forward. The handwriting grew frantic, lines carved into paper so deep they tore the parchment. Another entry read, "They dream in silence now. They do not ask me for food. They only wait. The sea is teaching them how to obey." His final entry contained only one chilling sentence. The voyage continues, even in death. What investigators could not decide was this. Did the captain kill them by madness, or did something answer him? The precision of the missing eyes suggested more than decay. The uniformity of the bindings suggested more than terror. It was as though the crew had surrendered willingly, as though they believed their blindness was passage, their hunger was ritual, their death was only another command. Villagers who glimpsed the writings claimed the ink was smeared with salt, though no sea spray had touched the parchment. Dock workers said that when the book was opened, the pages seemed damp, as if it breathed. One man swore he saw letters rearranged before his eyes, shifting into words he knew he had never learned. They burned the fragments eventually, but sailors still repeated the lines from memory, as if the words had taken root in their minds the moment they were spoken aloud. And yet the ship had returned. Not adrift in chaos, not shattered by storm, but guided, its hull intact, its path direct, as if an unseen hand steered it home. If the captain's curse ended at sea, why had the land been chosen as its grave? Why had it carried its story to shore, demanding to be seen, even when no eyes remained to witness? The villagers asked each other one question, never aloud but always in thought. What kind of faith binds tighter than fear, tighter even than death? And if such faith could summon obedience from the grave, was the captain mad? Or had he discovered a truth no living sailor wished to face? The curse was not that the ship had died at sea. The curse was that it had returned, carrying discipline sharpened into something unholy, something that did not end with life itself. For months, the ghost ship lay hidden under guard. Officials debated whether to burn it, sink it, or dismantle it piece by piece. Yet none dared to strike the first blow. Every worker ordered aboard reported strange sensations, shadows that did not match their owners, voices that spoke with no mouths, and an overwhelming sense of being counted, as if the ship tallied every soul that set foot upon it. Some refused outright. Others vanished after their shifts, never returning to their families, their names erased by silence. But the ship was not content with silence. Strange artifacts began appearing on the docks. Small tokens, a sailor's button where none had worked, a rope knot perfectly tied though no rope had been moved, water pooling in shapes like footprints that led nowhere. And then came the dreams. Dock workers described them with trembling voices, visions of themselves strapped to benches, their eyes taken, their mouths filled with salt. Husbands and wives reported that their loved ones would wake in the middle of the night gasping, clutching their faces as if something had been hollowed from them in sleep. One report spoke of a man who awoke screaming, clutching his face. His eyes were still in place, but he swore he could see nothing but water pressing against him, as though he had been lowered into the ocean and left there. He never spoke again, his voice stolen by the phantom drowning. Within weeks, he was dead. Another worker leapt into the sea one afternoon, thrashing wildly, insisting the ship had counted him wrong and was coming to collect the debt. His body was never found. The government tried to suppress these accounts, but sailors are storytellers by nature, and stories travel faster than edicts. Soon, every port from Lisbon to Bristol carried whispers of the cursed vessel. They called it the Testament of the Dead, a warning carved not in words, but in spectacle. Wherever sailors gathered, the same questions arose. Had the crew been victims of a madman? Or had they glimpsed something holy or unholy that demanded their devotion until their final breath? Fragments of testimony from survivors of nearby ships began to surface. One captain swore his men saw the cursed vessel during its final voyage, still afloat, its crew rigid and unmoving. They hailed it across the waves, but no reply came. Instead, they claimed they heard a low chant carried on the wind, a sound like dozens of voices whispering in unison. Another crew reported seeing its lanterns burn green, not with fire, but with some phosphorescent glow, a color that sank into the waves as though even the sea recoiled from it. But the most disturbing account came from a fisherman who insisted he had boarded it before it ever ran aground. He claimed he was invited aboard, lured by a voice promising coin for service. He found the men strapped already, still alive but silent, their eyes glassy with terror. The captain stood at the helm, speaking in a language the fishermen could not understand, while the crew's bodies trembled in rhythm as though answering an unseen choir. He fled, he said, by leaping into the sea, and swore that when he reached the shore, he could still hear the voices calling his name. What unsettled the investigators most was that many accounts aligned with fragments found in those writings. The book, though half destroyed, spoke of the choir beneath the waves, of obedience rehearsed until the flesh forgets hunger, and of eyes surrendered so the sea might see through us. Scholars debated whether these were ravings or liturgy. Clergymen refused to comment at all. But to sailors, it was enough to confirm that something had been bargained, something far older than storms or hunger. Then came the disappearances. Not just dock workers, but families who lived near the water. Children found staring at the tide, their pupils wide as though already hollowed. Women waking with their hands blistered by salt, though they had never touched the sea. Entire fishing boats never returning, their last sightings marked by witnesses who swore they sailed too close to the hidden ship. Fear no longer stayed on the docks. It spread inland, poisoning entire towns. Merchants complained of shortages, churches whispered of judgment, and officials quarreled over whether to destroy the ship or worship it. The government made its choice at last. They gathered men with torches, barrels of oil, and ordered the vessel burned. Before the flames were lit, one official boarded alone, declaring he would make a final inspection. He never returned. His screams were heard, echoing from the hull, but when others rushed in, the ship's interior was empty, the ropes untouched, the skeletons unmoved. They fled, abandoning him to whatever claimed him. Only then did they set the fire. Flames leapt, sails curled, wood blackened. Crowds gathered, hoping to see an end. Yet when dawn broke, the ship was still there, charred, smoldering, but whole. The ropes still bound the skeletons in place. The eyeless sockets still stared forward, untouched. The fire had burned, but the ship refused to die. "You cannot burn what has already been consecrated," one priest muttered before falling silent forever. The crowd dispersed in terror. No one tried again. To destroy the vessel was impossible. To leave it was unthinkable. So they did what humans always do when faced with the impossible. They tried to forget. What was left was not merely a wreck, but an altar, a structure that resisted destruction as though preserved by the will of the dead. And the villagers understood at last. This was not a ghost ship. It was a message. The voyage had not ended at sea. It had only changed its stage. The testament of the dead was not a story of one crew. It was a rehearsal for anyone who listened, a warning that obedience once offered is never reclaimed. And somewhere beyond the horizon, other captains sailed, still hungry for faith strong enough to blind, strong enough to bind, strong enough to carry death itself into harbor. The story of the ghost ship could not be buried. No law, no decree, no priestly silence could silence the sailors. The tale spread like a plague along the coasts, slipping into taverns and marketplaces, carried by men who swore they had seen it with their own eyes. The more governments tried to contain the story, the more irresistible it became. What was forbidden to speak became sacred to whisper. Soon the ghost ship was no longer just a rumor. It was a presence haunting every harbor. Ships began refusing to sail near the region where it had run aground. Fishermen abandoned rich waters, unwilling to risk drawing near the tide that carried its memory. Some ports reported strange echoes, bells tolling from the sea when no ship arrived, chains rattling across docks in the dead of night, and voices humming low hymns that seemed to come from beneath the planks themselves. Sailors said the sea was no longer silent. It was rehearsing, practicing the song of the dead until the living would learn its rhythm. Merchants lost fortunes as trade routes bent away from the cursed coastline. Authorities responded with punishments for fear-mongering. But how do you punish men who refuse to work because they believe the sea itself is watching them? Crews deserted en masse, captains stood alone on decks, and still the rumors grew. Some claimed to see skeletons walking the shallows at night, staring with sockets that glowed faintly as though lit from within. Others spoke of nets pulled from the deep, filled not with fish, but with bones, each skull scraped smooth where its eyes should have been. And then came the ships that vanished. Entire crews gone. Vessels found adrift weeks later, their cargo intact, their sails lowered neatly, but their decks empty. Not a single body remained, only ropes tied to benches as if awaiting passengers who never arrived. The pattern was too precise to dismiss. Other ships had begun to mirror the ghost ship, as though its curse was contagious, as though obedience was spreading not by touch, but by story. Hearing it was enough to bind you. One harbor master confessed that he began to tie ropes to the benches of his own patrol boats without knowing why, his hands moving with instinct rather than choice. Sailors laughed nervously when he told the tale, until they realized he was not alone. Dozens of men admitted to fastening knots compulsively, ropes across their bunks, ties across their doors, bindings across chairs. It was as if the story itself had hands, teaching the living how to prepare for a voyage they had not yet taken. Whispers grew darker still, that the eyeless crew had not been victims, but pioneers, that they had surrendered willingly to a faith deeper than the ocean, that their discipline had made them the first to join a choir that waited beneath the surface, calling for more voices to swell its hymn. Sailors began to fear sleep itself, for in dreams they saw the benches, the ropes, the sockets. Some woke with salt dried on their cheeks as though they had been crying underwater. Some never woke at all. In one port, tavern owners claimed their tables were found tied together with sailors' knots after closing, though no man had stayed behind. In another, mothers whispered that their children played games by binding each other to chairs, singing tuneless hymns about the sea. Priests warned against speaking of it, but even their sermons seemed powerless. The more they denounced it, the more people repeated it afterwards, eager to share the forbidden words. The curse had left the vessel and entered the land. The harbors became places of dread, not commerce. Nets rotted, ships warped at anchor, docks fell silent, and all the while the sea seemed patient, as though it could wait forever for its next crew. For men realized too late that the story was not simply told, it was inherited. Whoever listened too closely became part of it, and once heard, it could not be unheard. The story that spread through harbors was only the surface. Beneath it lay something deeper, something that sailors called the choir beneath the waves. They believed the ghost ship was not an isolated curse, but a doorway, an invitation to a congregation waiting below. For centuries, men had spoken of hearing strange harmonies at sea, sounds mistaken for wind or whale song. Now they swore those sounds were voices rehearsing endlessly for a hymn that would never end. Reports grew stranger. Entire crews claimed they could hear the voices during long voyages, especially on calm nights when the water was still as glass. Men described words without language, tones that burrowed into the skull, pulling their thoughts into rhythm. Some returned to shore, unable to speak anything but fragments of that chant. Their families said they answered questions in unison, their mouths moving together like echoes of one mind. Priests called it possession. Sailors called it rehearsal. Divers sent to inspect wrecks near the cursed coastline told of statues rising from the seabed, not carved by man, but formed by coral around bones. Ribs stretched into arches, skulls staring upward as though awaiting light. When the divers surfaced, they wept salt tears, though no water had entered their masks. One diver vanished entirely, his tether rope severed clean, though his partners swore they saw no blade. They only heard a low note vibrating through the water, shaking their teeth until blood filled their mouths. Others told of shapes glimpsed in the deep, rows of figures standing in perfect formation, as though a second crew waited below, bound not by rope but by the weight of water itself. Their mouths opened and closed in silence, but bubbles rose in unison, too precise to be chance. Men surfaced gasping, convinced they had seen the hymn performed in flesh beneath the sea. And then came the first recordings. A traveling scholar carried instruments meant to capture oceanic vibrations. One night, anchored near the wreck, his machine traced a pattern unlike anything natural. It was not random, not wind, not tide. It was structure, rhythm, harmony. He called it proof of the choir. Days later, he was found dead in his cabin, his notes scrawled with the phrase, "They are teaching me the song." His ears bled, his mouth still open as though mid-hymn. The legend deepened. The choir did not lure ships by chance. It selected them, drawing them with invisible threads, testing their discipline, rewarding obedience with blindness. For sight, the sailor said, was a distraction. True vision belonged to the sea. Eyeless sockets were not wounds, they were offerings. To stare into the void was to surrender the self, to let the ocean sing through hollow bone. Harbors became places of dread, not just because of fear, but because of inevitability. Sailors began to believe the choir was growing stronger. Every ship that vanished was not lost, but added to the harmony. Every man who heard the chant joined, whether in body or in dream. Some insisted the tide itself had rhythm now, waves rising and falling, not by wind but by song. Fishermen said the ocean breathed. Mothers rocked their children to sleep, only to realize the lullabies on their lips were not their own. Even inland, far from salt and tide, strange patterns appeared. Farmers plowing fields claimed that they heard humming under the soil. Market crowds noticed strangers whistling the same tune without ever meeting. In churches, choirs faltered, their hymns bending toward dissonant notes that matched the rhythm sailors had described. It was as if the sea had found its way into the breath of all who lived, rehearsing its hymn through unwilling mouths. The authorities dismissed it all as madness, but madness spreads when logic fails. And logic had no answer for why ships drifted back empty, why the sockets were hollow, why men who had never sailed woke screaming of ropes and benches. Something had been awakened, or perhaps it had always been there, patient, waiting, singing to the dark until someone finally listened long enough to carry its hymn ashore. And so the story changed again. It was no longer about one ship, one crew, one captain. It was about the choir. The sea was not silent. It had never been silent. It was only waiting for enough voices to make itself heard. The ship that washed ashore with its eyeless crew had seemed at first an isolated terror, a single tragedy, a mystery carved into wood and bone. But now its story had multiplied, spilling from harbors to seas, from seas to lands, from lands into dreams. It was no longer about a vessel. It was about a pattern, an inheritance of obedience that stretched deeper than the ocean and wider than the earth itself. The villagers who first found it no longer spoke of discovery. They spoke of initiation, for what they had witnessed had not been the end of a voyage, but the beginning of one. The ropes had not been restraints, but invitations. The sockets had not been mutilation, but transformation. What was horror had become ritual, and what was ritual had become contagion. Men who denied the tale found themselves humming the chant without realizing. Children who had never seen the sea drew benches and ropes in the dirt, their games rehearsals for something they could not name. Entire towns reported nights when silence fell, when every dog ceased barking, every bell ceased ringing, and in that silence they heard it. A low hymn moving through the air as if the world itself had learned the choir's song. The government abandoned its attempts to bury the vessel. It was sealed away, forgotten officially, yet always whispered about in taverns and chapels. Sailors marked their skin with salt to keep the song out, but even salt could not silence memory. One by one, ships vanished still, returning empty or not at all. Some said the sea itself had become the choir. Its waves the rhythm, its tides the breath, its storms the chorus. Others said it had always been so, and the ghost ship had only shown men the truth they had chosen not to hear. And here lies the question that no man, priest, or scholar could answer. What if the choir does not wait below? What if it waits within us, patient, silent, until the right story unlocks its hymn? Perhaps the crew had not been stolen, but awakened. Perhaps their sockets had not been emptied, but opened. Perhaps blindness was not the curse, but the doorway. The ship that drifted to shore was not carrying death. It was carrying instruction, a rehearsal for obedience so absolute it could bind flesh beyond hunger, beyond sight, beyond life. And if one crew could learn the song, why not another? Why not every port, every city, every land? The villagers once asked, staring at the eyeless skulls. Who kept them tied? Who stripped their eyes? Who steered the ship home? But perhaps they asked the wrong question. Perhaps the truth was simpler, darker, and closer than anyone dared believe. What if the ship was not guided by the dead at all? What if it was guided by the living, by us, by those who cannot stop listening, by those who cannot stop repeating, by those who even now, without meaning to, are humming the song? And what if the very act of hearing this tale binds you too? What if by picturing the ropes, the sockets, the hymn, you have already rehearsed the part meant for you? Stories like songs do not fade once heard. They wait. They root themselves in the mind, quiet at first, patient, until the moment comes to be sung aloud. So if tonight you hear a low rhythm in the silence, and do not mistake it for the sea. Do not tell yourself it is only memory, for the choir has always been waiting, and every voice, every single voice will one day be counted. And if you find the tune on your lips before sleep takes you, ask yourself one last question. Is it remembrance or is it invitation?